What is the best movie year ever? I've had this question on my mind a lot lately. That's not because 2024 has been an exceptional year for cinema. There's been some great films, of course, and many more I'm still excited to see, but overall, I would not consider 2024 a banner year for the movies. What 2024 has been is the 25th anniversary for a slew of modern classics. The Matrix, Fight Club, Eyes Wide Shut, Magnolia, Being John Malkovich, The Insider, The Sixth Sense. I could go on and on and on and on. You might have noticed some of these films playing at your local indie theater throughout the year, or think pieces like this one from The Guardian, acknowledging 1999 as one of the great years for cinema. This is not a new concept. 1999 is pretty widely cited as one of the best movie years ever, an argument which was even the subject of an entire book, appropriately titled Best Movie Year Ever by Brian Raftery. And it wasn't just that 1999 offered a slew of bangers which makes it so significant. As Raftery argues, 1999 marked a culmination of the decade's indie boom, where strange, auteur-driven oddities were finding more of an audience at the multiplex, and filmmakers granted more resources to realize their oddball visions. 1999 is not lacking for challengers in the best movie year ever debate. Just a year after Raftery's book, Farber and McClellan made the case for 1962 as the greatest movie year ever, 12 months that represented the strength of the classical Hollywood studio system in its final days, while marking the burgeoning glimpses of the coming New Hollywood. And speaking of New Hollywood, there's also 1967, which is less impressive for the overwhelming quantity of great movies released, and more for the impact the year's greatest films made in reshaping the content and form of American cinema. We also don't have to go decades back for great movie years. 2019 offers an embarrassment of riches, both all-time greats from old cinematic masters, and daring films from the young crop of great new directors. When I asked on social media what the best movie year of all time was, I got a range of answers. Amidst the familiar heavy hitters were oddball picks I hadn't even considered. One answer I got a lot was 1974, which marked a high point in New Hollywood artistry, most evident in the showdown for Best Picture that year, coming down to Chinatown and The Godfather Part 2. Another year which got a lot of support was 2007, which had an equally bold and staggering showdown for the Oscar in No Country for Old Men versus There Will Be Blood. There's also 1927 and the final triumphs of the silent era, 2001 and its mixture of nostalgic fun and heavy art pictures, 1984 and its proliferation of pop culture icons, 1994 and the stark divide between Hollywood and Indiewood, and also the year I was born, so it's definitely a contender. And all these years are still caught in the immortal shadow of 1939. If 1999 marked a peak in the hip Indiewood cinema, 1939 represented the unprecedented strength of the Hollywood studio system at the peak of its powers. Movies were the dominant pastime of the American public, and the year's lineup of cinematic offerings makes a great case for the medium's artistry. Many of the year's best films still widely beloved, even by those who don't typically watch old movies. So there's a lot of competition, but which year is the best year? Now, on the one hand, this is a silly question. You can find great movies every year if you look in the right places. Even years where new releases were compromised by world events, like the limited new releases in the thick of World War II or the COVID-19 pandemic, still offer enough quality films that one could theoretically make a case for them. There's also nothing inherently magical about the 365 days between January 1st and December 31st. The films which fall outside a specific year's range are not really so far removed from them, so perhaps we shouldn't take the best movie year question quite so seriously. But on the other hand, it's 1957. Good God, was 1957 a staggering year for the motion picture. I don't know why we're not talking about it all the time. It's a year which demonstrated the diverse range of cinematic artistry across multiple countries and genres, where the formulaic was executed impeccably and the experimental probed uncharted territories. 1957 was so good that you can't make a top 10 list without making some heinous snubs. 1957 was so good that whether you only watch high-class prestige or lowbrow trash, you're eating well. 1957 was so good that several of the greatest film directors of all time released multiple films, and in at least one case, multiple masterpieces. 1957 was so good that even the bad movies were good.
You see? You're stupid minds! Stupid!
You might be surprised by this answer. 1957 is not one of the lionized years like 99 or 62. There are no books making its case, nor an unending list of think piece articles. Best I could find was this Reddit thread from 5 years ago, shout out to Metsman1019, and this Washington Post article from 2014. Fellow YouTuber Filmstack also highlighted 1957 as one of 7 major years in his video on the subject in 2023. So 1957 has received some flowers, but it's not in the pantheon of best movie years. Indeed, you might be surprised I'm choosing any year from the 50s, as the decade is not always thought of as a particularly prosperous one for film. It was in the 50s that television cut into cinema's market share, taking people out of the theaters with the lure of moving images broadcast directly into their home. Hollywood responded to this challenge, along with the recession of their monopolistic control of the film industry, with spectacle. Widescreen Technicolor epics, casts of thousands, star-studded escapism with aging stars. And though effective for a time, these ingredients would transform into the bloat of a decaying studio system that the emerging new Hollywood would cut through a decade later. It may have been in the 60s that old Hollywood functionally came to an end, but the stage for that end was set in the 50s. And indeed, the stage is visible in 1957. It was a year where Hollywood entertainments were swelling bigger, where movie stars were getting demonstrably older, where the first of dozens of Elvis star vehicles were released. The year began with the announcement that RKO Pictures, previously one of the Big Five movie studios, would cease film production. It is not hard to find indicators of a system and industry in decline. It's very easy. In fact, it's easy to blow all these qualities out of proportion, accepting the least charitable interpretation and ignoring the artistry of cinema in 1957. Yes, Hollywood in the 50s was swelling to unsustainable levels, but there is also tremendous power in that scale and size when they're applied with intelligence and skill. Yes, the old Hollywood guard was entering their twilight years, but with age came experience. Many aging actors and directors expressing a mastery over their craft and producing great art. Yes, Elvis's film career would eventually devolve into self-parody, but you know what? Jailhouse Rock is pretty good. And amidst the symbols of Hollywood's declining past, 1957 also saw glimmers of its dawning future. Young filmmakers who made bold and original works, along with films which made scathing indictments of power and politics in America. Hollywood was more than a stodgy, decaying institution in 1957. On the contrary, it was vibrant, audacious, and alive. Plus, it's not like Hollywood was the only game in town. But I'm getting ahead of myself. We're gonna have to break the year's many impressive cinematic trends into smaller groups if we want to understand why 1957 was, and remains, the true best movie year ever.
That off, will you? What's the idea?
I've thus far spoken some trash about the old Hollywood system as it existed in the late 50s, but I really don't want to undersell the artistic potential of the Hollywood machine. There's a reason we call it the Dream Factory. It was a system which produced romantic escapism with unparalleled efficiency. And there's a reason said system endured for decades, surviving self-censorship, political tyranny, and a world war. The Hollywood version of life, with glamorous movie stars and extravagant production value, is an alluring fantasy. Many 1957 films dealt in this fantasy, with perhaps the most famous being An Affair to Remember, a melodrama where wealthy socialites Cary Grant and Deborah Kerr meet on a cruise ship and fall deeply in love, despite both being involved with other people. The film is very much indicative of old Hollywood romance, pure sentimentality buoyed by the unending charm of larger-than-life movie stars. Despite both characters technically coming dangerously close to adultery, Grant and Carr are so infectiously charming together that any sense of moral trespass is squashed. These two clearly belong together. An Affair to Remember is undeniably a classic, though if I'm being honest, it does start to lose me once our heroes leave the boat. So much of the film's appeal is rooted in simply seeing Grant and Carr share the screen, that when they're apart for most of the back half, I kinda check out. And not in the romantic yearning sense, but more in the when are they gonna get back to the fireworks factory sense. For that reason, An Affair to Remember is not my favorite piece of romantic escapism from 1957. My favorite is Funny Face.
I love your funny face.
Like An Affair to Remember, this is another star-studded romance, this time with Fred Astaire as the photographer for a fashion magazine and Audrey Hepburn as the pretty bookstore assistant plucked from obscurity to join the world of high fashion in Paris. But Funny Face is also a musical. The musical is the purest distillation of old Hollywood fantasy, where emotional highs transcend an earthly realm to a point that dialogue is insufficient and only song and dance can suffice. Musicals of course exist on the stage, but cinema's formal elements accentuate their spectacle, the camera responding to the dancers as if it too an active participant, the vibrancy of Technicolor imbuing settings which resemble reality an unreal beauty. These are aspects that Funny Face excels at. And despite the dazzling possibility of Technicolor, the film demonstrates restraint. Several locations feature a largely mono palette of white or black, punctuated by concentrated bursts of color. Rather than overwhelming the spectator with an onslaught, Funny Face seduces with precise splashes. That sense of precision is also relevant given where the Hollywood musical would go in the next decade or so. With the increasing reliance on roadshow theatrical exhibition, musicals in the 60s would skew increasingly epic, with longer runtimes, casts of thousands, and expensive, elaborate sets. The sheer spectacle of production value is impressive, but the bigger the Hollywood musical got, the more bloated it became. To the point that many of the biggest flops, which helped sound the death knell for the old Hollywood and ushered the grittier, more adult cinema of the 70s, were musicals. It's easy to blame the genre itself, but the problem with your Dr. Dolittles or Hello Dollys weren't that they were musicals, it's that they were ponderous slogs which buried their own charms under the weight of roadshow epicness. Funny Face doesn't have that problem. The film utilizes some of the formal elements that the roadshow also engaged in, notably being shot in VistaVision, Paramount's widescreen film process, and taking advantage with some striking compositions and bits of blocking empowered by that widescreen. At the same time though, Funny Face does not sink under the weight of a cast of thousands or stacking production value atop its story. It's light and loose, embracing the aesthetic strengths of roadshow musicals while eschewing their baggage, resulting in a moving fairy tale romance and pure cinematic pleasure. An Affair to Remember was directed by Leo McCarey, and Funny Face was directed by Stanley Donen, both highly accomplished filmmakers of classic Hollywood. McCarey's resume dates back to the silent era, but found his greatest success with talkies, including the original version of An Affair to Remember, Love Affair, part of the immortal 1939 Best Picture lineup. Donen's career doesn't stretch as far back. In fact, by 1957, he'd been directing movies for less than a decade, but already had established himself as one of the leading directors of the musical, alongside Vincent Minnelli. I bring this up because I think it's an important factor as to why Hollywood of the 50s didn't just survive despite a plethora of foundational challenges, but artistically thrived. The great many artists working within that system. Hitchcock, Wyler, Minnelli, Mankiewicz, Hawks, Zinnemann, Curtiz. These weren't just cogs toiling in the dream factory. They were artists who had mastered their craft and harnessed the system's machinery in their creative expression. And in 1957, two of the biggest classical Hollywood filmmakers released multiple films apiece. First, we have the quintessential American director, John Ford, who released two movies in 1957, The Wings of Eagles and The Rising of the Moon. The former is essentially a biopic of Ford's friend, Navy pilot turned Hollywood screenwriter Spig Weed, played by Ford's ultimate leading man, John Wayne. The latter is an anthology film set in Ireland, documenting Irish character, be it in social customs or resistance to British imperialism. These are each among Ford's least known and seen films of the decade, and I'm not going to pretend either is a secret masterpieces. They are minor entries in the John Ford canon. But minor Ford is still pretty enticing, and these are each very well made films, full of beautiful imagery and cinematic ingenuity. I'm especially impressed by The Wings of Eagles, which balances an astonishing degree of disparate tones. Chronicling a man's life means portraying a wide range of emotional extremes, especially for someone whose life was as diverse and multifaceted as Spig's. The Wings of Eagles shifts between military service comedy to inspiring injury rehab drama to an inside Hollywood movie about movies before finally climaxing in World War II as a combat film. And in the midst of all this, there's also a decade-spanning love affair between Spig and his wife. The movie really shouldn't work, but somehow Ford is able to take the silliest comedic episodes hand in hand with the most devastating tragedy. What strikes me most about this pairing is how each uses opposite means to arrive at the same end. The Wings of Eagles fully embraces the artifice of classic Hollywood. It's clearly shot on sets and sound stages. It clearly streamlines the real events of Spig's life for the sake of narrative simplicity. And perhaps most importantly, it stars John Wayne. Unlike our modern era of biopic where actors engage in mimicry of a real person, Wayne is not doing a Spig Weed impression. He is imbuing Spig with his own movie stardom. The film is, in every sense, a Hollywoodization of Spig's life. The Rising of the Moon, on the other hand, strips away all that Hollywood glamour. Where The Wings of Eagles prioritizes the audience's entertainment, The Rising of the Moon sidelines plot in favor of character, be it the people on screen or the locations they inhabit. The film is shot in black and white, on location in Ireland, and without movie stars. Tyrone Power appears briefly in the film's introduction, but each segment of the anthology is filled with Irish character actors. Yet these conflicting methods each inform a tribute for something Ford deeply loved: his dear friend Spig, who had died a decade prior, and the home country of Ford's ancestry that shaped his strong sense of ethnic pride. I called these movies minor Ford, but that's only true from the perspective of canonization. As works of personal expression, The Wings of Eagles and The Rising of the Moon are both essential John Ford texts. And that expression goes deeper than just a loving tribute. There's a filmmaker character played by Ward Bond in The Wings of Eagles that's clearly a stand-in for Ford himself, but the character Ford most resembles is actually Spig. Like Spig, Ford was deeply invested in military hierarchy and yearned to serve his country. While Spig's naval career was cut short by injury, Ford was kept out of service by failed entrance exams and later poor eyesight. Both men instead found their greatest success making manly movies in the phony show business of Hollywood. But with World War II, Spig and Ford finally had an opportunity to join the fight. Spig as a strategist on a cruiser, Ford as a filmmaker for the War Department, including documenting the Battle of Midway, each bearing witness to the aerial battles on the Pacific. The film's final scene, where Spig is honored by his peers and friends for his service, is a heartfelt tribute to a friend, but it's also an expression of Ford's own pride, with a hint of lamentation that said days are now long behind. For a filmmaker who was often reticent to speak about himself or his art when interviewed, The Wings of Eagles is one of the most nakedly revealing films John Ford ever made. Our second big studio director is Billy Wilder, the Austrian immigrant turned Hollywood screenwriter in the 30s and hyphenated writer-director in the 40s. By the 50s, Wilder was one of Hollywood's leading filmmakers, his run of classics between 1950 and 1960 rivaled only by Alfred Hitchcock. In 1957, Wilder released no less than 3 movies. First up is The Spirit of St. Louis, a dramatization of Charles Lindbergh's record-breaking transatlantic flight from New York to Paris in 1927. Which honestly, I think is one of Wilder's worst movies. So concerned with the spectacle of Lindbergh's achievement and the special effects to realize it, that the wit and fun the director so excelled at are minimized. Next up is Love in the Afternoon, which is much better. A light romantic comedy with Gary Cooper as a sophisticated gentleman and Audrey Hepburn as the girl feigning a worldliness she doesn't really possess. These sorts of character dynamics and romantic entanglements allow for more ingenuity and cleverness, and it helps that Hepburn was at the peak of her stardom, but the film is closer to Wilder's mid-tier. What most hurts it is that the sparks never quite fly between Hepburn and Cooper. Part of this might well be the modern standards clashing against the sizable age gap between the actors, but that isn't the whole story. The gap between Hepburn and Esther is even bigger, but Funny Face still gets me swooning in a way Love in the Afternoon doesn't. So far I'm not making a great case for Wilder in 1957, but don't worry, the man had one more film in the chamber.
You and the rich, lonely widow all alone in that lonely house with a gramophone blaring the Mikado. Perhaps you turned up the volume to drown out her cries.
No, when I left her, she was alive.
When the housekeeper came back, she was dead.
Wilder would close out the year with Witness for the Prosecution, a star-studded courtroom drama anchored by Charles Laughton as a famous lawyer recovering from a heart attack when he takes Tyrone Power's high-profile murder case. The case does not look good for old Tyrone, who is accused of murdering a wealthy widow who had fallen in love with him. As a penniless inventor, Tyrone had motivation to bump off the widow, motivation made apparent when her will awards him an $80,000 payout. Tyrone's wife is played by the great Marlene Dietrich, who will come to play a critical role in his trial, but I dare not say more. The film's end credits urge viewers not to spoil its ending for fellow moviegoers, and I will respect that instruction. Suffice it to say, watching the plot reveal itself in the courtroom and in flashbacks is one of Witness for the Prosecution's greatest pleasures, culminating in a deliciously twisty climax. Much of these details stem directly from Agatha Christie's original stage play, but Wilder makes a crucial addition in the character of Miss Plimsoll, the private nurse of our superstar lawyer, struggling to maintain his health as he indulges in personal vices and takes on the stress of defending an accused murderer. Plimsoll is played by Laughton's real-life wife, Elsa Lanchester, and the two have fantastic chemistry, indicative of an old married couple. Her presence has a massive impact on the story, humanizing the otherwise grandiose Sir Wilfrid Roberts by highlighting his vulnerability and dependence. She also adds a surge of comedy to the proceedings in her banter with Laughton, but her storytelling value goes far deeper than simple comedic relief. Consider the film's first act, which at its core is really a single extended scene where Sir Wilfrid returns to his office, meets with his chief clerk who proposes some routine legal work to get back in the swing of things, then meets with a fellow lawyer who brings the murder case to Wilfrid's attention, then Tyrone Power's Leonard Vole who tells his side of the story, and then finally, Leonard's wife. It is a dense, near 40-minute block of expository conversations only briefly interrupted by flashbacks to Leonard's courtship with the deceased. And it's all important plot information that the audience needs, but it also runs the risk of growing tedious, especially given the limited setting. So Wilder structures this act around a series of confrontations between nurse and patient, where Plimsoll repeatedly intervenes to tend to Wilfrid's poor health, while Wilfrid continuously tries to circumvent her, sneaking cigars or escaping her watch to hear more about the murder case. These aren't funny breaks from the plot, they're sites of conflict, where the solution to that conflict is returning to the heavy plot exposition. In that sense, Miss Plimsoll serves an integral storytelling role, blocking Wilfrid and the audience from the story, and in doing so, increasing our desire for it. Wilder underlines this point in the act's ending. Wilfrid does not just take the case, his acceptance is marked by Miss Plimsoll acquiescing and lighting Wilfrid's cigar, closing the pair's first act conflict and signifying Wilfrid's health concerns will be taking a back seat to his responsibilities as a lawyer. And there's another storytelling boon which comes from Miss Plimsoll and her humorous relationship with Wilfred. It distracts us. Our focus is so effectively directed to the comedy and conflict in Plimsoll sniffing out hidden cigars or Wilfred's daring escape on a stair lift that we lower our guard. We aren't prepared for the twists and turns that the story has in store for us, and that makes the eventual reveals so much more impactful. It's that sophistication that makes Witness for the Prosecution such an exceptional example of Hollywood filmmaking at its best. The film is far from the flashiest movie of 1957, or even Wilder's flashiest movie of 1957, but it is a masterclass in storytelling which prioritizes the audience's entertainment. More than costly production value and glamorous movie stars, it's the function of movies as entertainment that most fully defines that old Hollywood magic. Indeed, the movies in this section have been highlighted not merely for their artistic quality, but as indicators of the strengths of the Hollywood studio system in the 50s. Witness for the Prosecution is a supreme piece of entertainment.
And you're satisfied, I hope?
The Wings of Eagles and The Rising of the Moon are the kind of personal filmmaking the Dream Factory empowered. Funny Face and An Affair to Remember, the kinds of spectacle old Hollywood did so well. And also the kinds modern Hollywood doesn't really make anymore. We still get love stories, of course, but they're more cynical and guarded. We still get musicals, but the vibrant and joyous Technicolor extravaganzas are pretty firmly a thing of the past. Even when modern musicals are explicitly set in a fantasy land, their colors are dimmed. I don't mean to turn this into an old man yells at cloud style besmirching of the present, but an acknowledgement of the past. Old Hollywood really was capable of beautiful works of art, and this crop of films demonstrate the realization of that potential. But big movies aren't everything. The biggest Western of 1957 was Gunfight at the OK Corral, Paramount's star-studded smash hit with Burt Lancaster as lawman Wyatt Earp and Kirk Douglas as his rival-turned-ally Doc Holliday. It's pretty good. Lancaster and Douglas, in addition to their sheer auras, also have great chemistry, and the titular gunfight is a rousing burst of action. But the thing about 1957 is that the smaller the westerns get, the better they tend to be. A step below the bigness of Gunfight at the OK Corral, we find The Tin Star and 3:10 to Yuma. Both have movie stars of their own, but they aren't star vehicles. Both are still Hollywood movies and feature the requisite action a Hollywood Western promises, but they're also quieter and more contemplative. The Tin Star follows a grizzled bounty hunter who reluctantly takes an inexperienced young sheriff under his wing, while 3:10 to Yuma is concerned with a rancher who escorts a captured outlaw to the train, which will take him to trial for his crimes. Simple premises, but each begets an exploration of what it means to stand up for justice, what defines a hero, and more baseline still, what defines a man. Both films are invested in very traditional forms of masculinity, men as protectors and providers, but there are nuances within those traditions. The Tin Star begins as a story of the hardened and strong Henry Fonda needing to show the less explicitly masculine Anthony Perkins how to be a tough guy. But as the plot unfolds, the film becomes as much about Fonda adapting Perkins' moral integrity. Both men end up learning from each other, and in effect the film's portrait of idealized masculinity combines Fonda's competence with Perkins' sense of fairness. Only with the latter can power be wielded responsibly. 3:10 to Yuma is also built on a shifting power dynamic between two men, albeit a far more adversarial one, with Glenn Ford's villain trying to break Van Heflin's psychology in his efforts to escape the law. Here, questions of heroism and masculinity are bound together in a temptation story. The test of Heflin's manhood is his ability to hold to his word in the face of the physical and psychological pressures Ford stacks against him. And what's especially great about both these films is they don't posture as capital I issue movies about masculinity. On the contrary, each employs the utterly unpretentious language of Western escapism, and each is gripping in that regard. You don't have to look for the deeper meanings in these films to have a good time with them, but those who go looking will be rewarded. One thing I was especially surprised to find was the Tin Star's treatment of anti-Indigenous racism. There's a scene where Fonda learns his love interest's son is a mixed-race Indigenous boy, and his instinctive reaction betrays his racism. He is called out for this, and later admits that his social conditioning has ingrained social biases within him that are not so easily shaken. It is a remarkably mature acknowledgement of how widespread racial prejudices are in a racist society, that even the good guy is prone to bigotry. He may not act on that bigotry in violence or harassment like the film's villain does, but they are both part of the same social fabric. The film does vaguely imply, or at least suggest, that Fonda might continue to work on overcoming his racial biases, but it doesn't suddenly pivot into a story of overcoming racism, because it understands, at least on some level, that racism cannot be tidily overcome in a 90-minute Western. Speaking of time, I also appreciate how there's about 20 minutes between Fonda's racist response and his own acknowledgement of it, allowing the audience to really sit with the idea that the film's hero is a racist before he's given any kind of reprieve. Moving away from major studio productions, we enter the realm of B-movies and the ran-on westerns. The ran-on westerns refer to a series of low-budget cowboy flicks made in the late 50s by the team of director Bud Boddicker, star Randolph Scott, and producer Harry Joe Brown. These movies strip the western of excess down to its core elements. Lean stories of vengeance, survival, and justice on desert plains and dusty towns. 1957 saw two films from this cycle, and two of the best for that matter, The Tall T and Decision at Sundown. Now, you might expect, given their B-movie status, these films would indulge in shallow western power fantasy and escapism, but that isn't the case at all. The Tall T especially denies its hero power. Scott doesn't play a sheriff or a badass gunslinger, he plays Pat Brennan, a down-on-his-luck rancher who hitches a stagecoach ride with some newlyweds, only to be robbed by a trio of crooks who take the passengers hostage. We know from Scott's other roles and his generally strong masculine presence that he is capable, but he's also vulnerable, spending much of the film under villain Frank Usher's gun.
You know what's gonna happen to you?
I think so.
You scared?
Yeah.
The excitement of the action isn't a question of how much ass Brennan will kick, it's if he'll survive at all. Scott is more empowered in Decision at Sundown, but also more morally compromised. The film opens with Scott's Bart Allison and his friend Sam riding into the town of Sundown, seeking revenge on Tate Kimbrough, the man Bart blames for his wife's suicide. Again, Scott's prior roles encourage us to see Bart in a certain light, as a hero, justified in his pursuit of vengeance. But the longer the film goes, and the more we learn about Bart's past and his enemy's role in Sundown, the more dubious and ill-advised Bart's vengeance seems. I don't want to give too much away about the story, but one detail I especially like is that it's not simply the case that Tate is actually completely innocent and a good and virtuous person. Rather, it's the case that the problems, history, and social relations which bind all these people are too complex to be easily solved with a gunfight on Main Street. This is also indicative of what makes the ran-on westerns so pleasurable. Not merely the visceral excitement they offer, but the layered storytelling. The Tall T is especially great, a nail-bitingly tense examination of virtue in the face of hardship, with a fascinating dynamic of respect and antagonism between hero and villain. It's my favorite ran-on western, but the throne for the best western of 1957 belongs to another. "40 Guns" is so damn good. It's a film which essentially combines all the positive traits across the year's best westerns into one exceptional package. Like the ran-on cycle, 40 Guns comes from the world of B-movies. The film was directed by Sam Fuller, one of the earliest heroes of B cinema, made adjacent to the studio system, but fundamentally outside of it. Like The Tall T and Decision to Sundown, 40 Guns is lean and to the point, yet still layered in its plotting and character relations. In a tight 80 minutes, the film explores the complex social web weave from lawman Griff Bonnell's loyalty to his brothers, his commitment to justice, and his attraction to hardened landowner Jessica Drummond, who is herself torn between her responsibilities as a leader and having to manage her screw-up brother. Like the Tin Star in 3:10 to Yuma, 40 Guns combines Western escapism with thoughtful genre commentary. All the more impressively, Fuller makes this critique primarily through cinematic language. My favorite example of this is the infamous rifle barrel framing. In addition to clearly inspiring the James Bond franchise and just, generally looking cool, this is also a potent distillation of how pervasive and all-encompassing violence in this genre is, an idea which will bleed through the rest of the film. And like Gunfight at the OK Corral, 40 Guns harnesses the power of the Hollywood machine. This despite the fact that it was a low-budget B-movie. But look at these immaculate widescreen compositions. Look at the spectacle in Brocky's drunken rampage through town, or the tornado sequence. And look at Barbara Stanwyck.
Would you gentlemen excuse us, please?
Stanwyck was entering the twilight of her career in 1957, largely due to sexist double standards about aging women in Hollywood. But she brings an experienced movie star's history and authority to Jessica Drummond, and it imbues the entire film with a greater sense of gravitas. 40 Guns is the B-movie that outdid all the other B-movies and also surpassed its larger budget, more ostensibly respectable peers. But I don't want to turn this into too much of a competition. Part of why I wanted to spotlight the westerns of 1957 is to demonstrate the range and variety across the genre at the time. Despite a lot of similarities and overlap, literally 3 of the films involve a stranger arriving in town and becoming a lawman, the year's westerns show a versatility in mood, affect, and style, as well as a B-cinema able to go toe-to-toe with the studio heavyweights. And speaking of B-movies, I made a joking reference to Plan 9 from Outer Space earlier, but I'd be remiss if I didn't admit that this is kind of a cheat. Plan 9 technically had its first public screening in 1957, then under the title Grave Robbers from Outer Space, but it wouldn't release more widely until the following year. Really though, I don't have to cheat because 1957 is bustling with pulpy horror and sci-fi flicks. This was the era where those two genres were most closely intertwined, as the atomic age inspired a wave of movies about radioactive monsters and alien invaders. 1957 is awash in such tales. Giant crab monsters, giant cyclops, giant aliens, giant robots serving the interest of a conquering alien race. Yet at a time when the genre skewed big, its best outing was a tale about getting smaller. While most of these movies amounted to some silly fun, The Incredible Shrinking Man is legitimately really good, at once a thrilling genre movie and a fascinating rumination on the atomic age. The film is likely most famous for its set pieces, the third act seeing our shrinking hero do battle with the family cat, and eventually a spider. The special effects have certainly aged, but the mixture of large-scale sets and props, combined with rear-screen projection, is still wildly impressive and effective. These scenes don't play as quaint, they're still tense and exciting. But the film also takes its titular shrinking man's predicament pretty seriously. There's an underspoken psychosexual subtext to Scott's anxieties, a fear of a man getting too small. It's perhaps not coincidence that marital troubles are among the first to arise from Scott's condition. Ultimately, though, I'm more interested in the socio-political subtext. There's a pointed despair to Scott Carey's gradual reduction, a fear that he is slowly withering away into nothing. Where so many of the atomic-aged horror and science fiction stories referred in some way to the spectacle of nuclear power, The Incredible Shrinking Man instead stews in powerlessness, in humanity being so overwhelmed by nuclear power that we are receding into nothing. In an era where atomic age paranoia dominated horror and science fiction, The Incredible Shrinking Man still finds a unique angle on such themes and phobias. And this is not to say all horror in 1957 was concerned with nuclear power. Of all the year's giant monster movies, the best one is most certainly Night of the Demon, where the monster is a literal demon from hell and the villains are a satanic cult. The film was a British production, and indeed, Britain would have a pretty good year in horror cinema. Legendary horror institution Hammer Productions would find success with The Abominable Snowman, Quatermass 2, and most significantly, The Curse of Frankenstein. The Curse of Frankenstein is maybe the most important film Hammer ever made, a massive hit that re-established the studio as the maker of gothic horror, remaking the iconic classics of the Universal catalog, now in color, with more gore, more sex, and new horror icons in Peter Cushing and Christopher Lee. Dialogue from Curse of Frankenstein is also the first sound heard on the White Zombie album Astro Creep 2000.
Perhaps you had better start from the beginning. Perhaps you had better start from the beginning.
If that isn't legacy, I don't know what is. Westerns, horror, and science fiction were all thriving in 1957, and they weren't alone. I've already discussed some of the musical's triumphs, and those are even more important if you also take into account the precedents being set in India, with the sweeping historical epic Mother India, or the mixture of romantic fantasy and social realism in Piazza. The year also saw significant comedies, melodramas, and two of the greatest courtroom dramas ever made. But when it comes to the best film genre of 1957, there's really only one answer. War is pervasive in the films of 1957. In some films, it is a haunting backdrop for the narrative and characters. Antonius Block's chess match with death in The Seventh Seal is informed by the Knights' years fighting in the Crusades. Lord Washizu's regicide for the throne in Throne of Blood is contextualized by the civil wars of the Sengoku era in Japan. Even a musical comedy like Silk Stockings is predicated on the Cold War tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union, and the films which tackled war, not on the periphery but as its central subject, were not only among the best films of the year, they still stand as some of the greatest war films ever made. That's perhaps surprising given, for as pervasive as war was throughout the year, 1957 doesn't offer a lot of combat movies. Combat scenes? Absolutely. The doomed charge on the anthill in Pass of Glory is equal parts exhilarating and despairing. The mobile camera of The Cranes Are Flying conveys the scope of armed combat while forging an intimacy with the men struggling to survive. The Bridge on the River Kwai's final act largely concerns military espionage, which culminates in a glorious display of pyrotechnics. These films don't just have action, their action is audacious, ambitious, and exceptionally well crafted. But it's also not what any of these movies are really about. Battles in these films are part of a larger tapestry and beget an examination of concepts in war beyond combat. Paths of Glory is as much a courtroom drama as it is a war picture. Its bravura battle scene pretext for the film's true centerpiece, the trial of 3 soldiers erroneously charged with cowardice. None of these men should be here. The battle was always hopeless, an impossible goal largely motivated by one general's career ambitions than any strategic value, and the men selected are representations to be made examples of rather than being there for their own specific action or inaction. Indeed, the trial is little more than a formality. Most court customs are ignored, and defense lawyer Colonel Dax's efforts to mount a case for the men are mitigated or refuted by the court. While the horrors of war are persistently felt at the edges of the frame, it's the miscarriage of justice that is the source of the film's greatest rage, an extension of a system where the wealthy discard the lives of the poor as carelessly as they do eggshells. And it's an interest in the disregarded lives in war which also motivates The Cranes Are Flying. The film tells the tragic story of Boris and Veronica, young lovers separated when the Nazis invade Russia and Boris enlists in the army. Though some of Boris's warfront experiences are shown, the film's greatest drama is found on the home front. Veronica is not merely faced with the devastating bomb raids leveling Moscow, but also the predatory advances of Boris's cousin Mark, and her eventual subjugation at his hands. Each act of violence leaves Veronica more isolated, with little to cling on to beyond the hope that her beloved might be okay. What makes all this hurt that much more are the film's first few minutes, which show the couple at their most blissful and innocently in love. It's not a long stretch of the film, but the performances and cinematography are so wondrous that it's easy to invest wholly in their passion. Moreover, Veronica's sacrifices will not be honored in song or stone. Her suffering does not serve the grander purpose that Boris's does. It's just suffering. And while that is undeniably heavy, the film's craft is so exquisite that it's never hard to watch. Mikhail Kalatozov's collaborations with cinematographer Sergei Yurosevsky are famous for their astonishing imagery, technically brilliant and thematically essential. One of my favorite examples is the scene where the soldiers march off to war as Veronica races desperately through a crowd to say goodbye to Boris. The long takes as the camera matches Veronica's energy really convey the physical struggle to work through the space, and I really love this tracking shot, which gives glimpses to other families being torn apart, contextualizing our hero's struggles within a greater sense of community. This whole sequence is also effective setup for the film's climax, where Veronica again moves through a crowd, this time as soldiers return home. I won't spoil the details, but the complexity of emotions the film and actress Tatyana Samolova convey here is nothing less than breathtaking. The war films which come the closest to combat movies are Bitter Victory and Cannell. Both are set in World War II, the former on the Western Desert Campaign and follows two officers who lead a troop of soldiers behind enemy lines in Nazi-occupied Benghazi, the latter during the end days of the Warsaw Uprising, as Polish rebels are forced into the sewers by Nazi forces. The plots are pushed forward by action, and a core tension across both is sheer survival, in combat and in the extreme conditions that combat pushes our heroes into. And yet, these also aren't the kinds of war movies for dads to kick back and demo disc their home theater setup with. For one thing, they're too small. Cannell is all about the restrictive claustrophobia the heroes trudge through, while Bitter Victory's action scenes are small-scale skirmishes rather than full-blown battles. Moreover, despite resembling action movies, these films have deeper concerns. Bitter Victory's action is primarily a vessel for the masculine competition between Richard Burton and Kurt, star of The Spy Who Loved Me Juergens, each having previously loved the same woman, now trying to prove themselves through their mission. There's an implicit criticism of war as an expression of performative masculinity, which is all the more prescient given the film is set in the Middle East. But on a more basic level, the film confronts the viewer with a man who fails to live up to the ideals of an officer or a war movie hero. Cowardice instead becomes all-consuming, rendering the final celebration of mission accomplished a hollow pageantry. And Cannell is just suffocatingly grim. The film is all about the doomed final days of a resistance movement, forced to trek through filth as it's grinded into oblivion. That the war movies of 1957 trended towards the somber and the bleak might be due to the fact that most of these films were outsiders to the Hollywood system of grand entertainment. Cannell and The Cranes Are Flying were from Poland and Soviet Russia, respectively. Paths of Glory was made cheaply and largely funded through Kirk Douglas's star power. And while director Nicholas Ray was a major force of classic Hollywood, Bitter Victory was primarily a French production. And then there's Kwai. Unlike the rest of this company, The Bridge on the River Kwai was a tentpole Hollywood production, a roadshow epic which dominated the box office and award season. There's a narrative here, one of foreign and independent films which explored the horror and tragedy of war unflinchingly, only to be overshadowed by the big Hollywood spectacle. To be sure, Kwai is much more capital E entertaining than the year's other war pictures, and it also sidesteps hard-hitting realism in favor of compelling drama. But this narrative ignores one simple fact. The Bridge on the River Kwai is one of the greatest movies ever made. Set in a Japanese POW camp in World War II, the film is primarily concerned with two colonels, Saito, the camp commandant, and Nicholson, the British officer who arrives with his men as the film opens. Saito is under strict orders to direct his prisoners in the completion of a railway bridge, while Nicholson resists, citing Geneva Convention rulings that forbid imprisoned officers from forced manual labor. So begins the war of wills between the men, at first as mutually antagonistic enemies, but eventually as strange allies, each working together towards the completion of the bridge. This is the first striking aspect of the Bridge on the River Kwai. For all its visual beauty and production value, this is a fundamentally intimate story about two men, similar in their competence and pride, yet torn apart by their national alliances and the cultural customs which come with them. David Lean is by now most famous for helming gargantuan epics, but he began his career directing small-scale dramas, and those instincts are evident even in a film this big. Lean brings attention to the quieter moments a lesser film would lose in the spectacle. One of my favorite examples of this is towards the end, as Nicholson walks the now completed bridge. Saito looks upon the sunset and remarks,
"Beautiful."
And Nicholson responds,
"Yes, beautiful. A first-rate job."
Referring to the bridge. It is a perfect distillation of their relationship, so close to each other, yet incapable of seeing eye to eye, even when they ostensibly agree. The scene also indicates a fascinating shift in character priorities, that the defiant, stiff upper lip Brit is far more invested in the bridge's construction than the colonel for whom said construction was a duty. For Saito, the bridge is a responsibility, something bestowed down to him from higher authority that he must simply obey. But Nicholson imbues the bridge with a far more fervent sense of national pride, viewing its building as an opportunity to demonstrate British value, proof that even in defeat, the British soldier can still produce greatness. That such efforts border on collaboration with the enemy are objections he ignores. So determined is Nicholson that he eventually volunteers his officer's assistance, which was the initial basis of his conflict with Saito. Despite this hypocrisy, Alec Guinness is so compelling and so believable as a leader that it's easy to be swayed by Nicholson. But by the end, the man is forced to face the ways in which his moral victory has come at the service of the Japanese war effort, and the assured pride which has underscored Nicholson's presentation throughout the film is suddenly thrown into question. What emerges is a cautionary tale about the dangers of nationalist pride, a warning that utter commitment to an imagined ideal distorts material reality and the consequences of your choices. For all his composure and dignity, Nicholson is a portrait of philosopher George Santayana's idea of a fanatic, someone who redoubles his efforts while losing sight of his goal. And no, the fact that I learned that quote from Batman the Animated Series does not make it any less illuminating or poignant in this context. That the Bridge on the River Kwai makes this sort of self-critique while still thriving as an adventurous war epic is a testament to the sophistication of its storytelling, operating at multiple levels with an effortless grace. The film's success as a piece of entertainment is in fact essential to its political critique. It's because we're so entertained that the ending hits us so powerfully, jarring us out of our previously held perceptions of the story we've been watching. It's curious that 1957 offered a trove not just of war movies or even great war movies, but war movies that were explicitly self-critical, questioning the values of the good guys and focusing on horror and suffering rather than honor and heroism. What might account for the world weariness that marks the war films of 1957? Some reasons were very culturally specific. The liberalization of the Soviet Union following Joseph Stalin's death in 1953 directly shaped the Cranes Are Flying's portrayal of war, less bound by propagandizing cliches of wise leaders and noble sacrifices. The distance from World War II more generally likely contributed to filmmakers' willingness to face the war so critically, far enough in the past that the films don't need to act as recruitment tools, yet before the Men on a Mission films had turned the conflict into a site of escapism. There's also the fact that the enduring Cold War squashed any myths that World War II was a simple victory, instead evolving into an era of sustained and heightened conflict. Ultimately, though, there isn't one grand narrative that cleanly explains the proliferation of war movies in 1957. Whatever the case, it is a subject which transcends nations and generations. Though most of these directors were already old masters, there are a couple of youth sprinkled throughout. Andrzej Wajda was only 30 when he made Cannell, while Passive Glory was just the fourth feature from a young upstart named Stanley Kubrick. Amidst the triumphs of the established Hollywood power players were also glimpses of the American cinema's future. Two young filmmakers who'd go on to be leaders in their field would each make a cinematic breakthrough in 1957. Kubrick had made other features, including the excellent heist film The Killing the previous year, but the technical scale and emotional complexity of Passive Glory demonstrated substantial growth. The power of the film's anti-war message, the strength of Kirk Douglas's lead performance, and the general craft on display all declared Kubrick a major talent, and this is something reflected in the film's critical response. Despite its low box office earnings, Passive Glory was well reviewed. It was also controversial, banned in several European countries especially for its criticism of military. That no doubt hurt the film commercially, but it's also the kind of response that marks a serious work from a serious artist. And yet, for all the pedigree Kubrick was building, with hindsight, Passive Glory doesn't appear all that Kubrickian. For all its despair and cynicism, it's also a deeply sentimental movie, an earnest plea for human life, which concludes with a lament for all the lives wasted in war. Dax himself is the kind of moral paragon Kubrick would later abandon as protagonist after Spartacus. The world of Passive Glory may be corrupt, but its hero is innocent in a way future Kubrick leads would not be. But for all that's atypical, there are also clear indicators of the Kubrick to come. Already we see Kubrick's affinity for tracking shots and wide-angle lenses, as well as his first uses of one-point perspective compositions, where our eyes are drawn to a single point in the distance of a long shot. Passive Glory also sees Kubrick developing his sense of irony. The film establishes an ironic contrast in its opening seconds, as martial music and voiceover explaining war between Germany and France underscores a pan to the chateau, the elegant manner where the officers meet, a wealthy oasis amidst the impoverished trenches and battlefields. The film's editing and visual strategy places tremendous emphasis on this contrast, and both it and the one-point perspective culminate with the film's dramatic peak, the men's execution, and a hard cut to breakfast at the chateau. It is the clearest distillation of Passive Glory's thesis, that war is an exercise where the poor are slaughtered in droves to advance the interest of the ruling class.
The men died wonderfully.
And that irony would continue to develop in Kubrick's future work, evolving into a dark comedy which ranged from the understated to the downright farcical.
Gentlemen, you can't fight in here, this is the war room!
Passive Glory is not going for laughs, obviously. It's a deeply angry movie, but there's a direct line between Moreau's flippancy and Buck Turgidson arguing nuclear war would result in no more than 10 to 20 million Americans killed, tops.
Depending on the breaks.
In Brûleur's belief that
there are few things more fundamentally encouraging and stimulating than seeing someone else die.
And the Colonel, who insists that
we are here to help the Vietnamese because inside every gook there is an American trying to get out.
Though its effects are fundamentally different from Kubrick's later works, how Passive Glory achieves those ends lay the foundation for those works. If Paths of Glory predicted the future of its auteur, 12 Angry Men predicted the future of American cinema writ large. The debut feature from Sidney Lumet, 12 Angry Men is the purest, most stripped-down form of drama. Virtually everything occurs in real time in a single room, as our 12 jurors debate the innocence or guilt of a young Hispanic boy accused of murder. And it is utterly riveting. The modest credits sequence with the jurors coming into the room in a detached long shot is deceptive, feigning a casual atmosphere that will slowly transform into debates of the utmost intensity and excitement, a shift Lumet marks with the visual strategy of wide group shots giving way to increasingly claustrophobic close-ups of sweaty, snarling faces. At a time when the Hollywood cinema was embracing grandiose spectacle, 12 Angry Men thrived with limitation and intimacy. The base plot momentum, where Henry Fonda's juror number 8 slowly wins over his fellow jurors through sound arguments for not guilty, is enthralling, not the least bit because each debate reveals the ideologies and biases of the jurors themselves. And that speaks to the greater depth and intelligence of the film, not merely a riveting legal drama, but an inquiry into the responsibilities of the law. The film's fundamental assumption is that the power the law holds demands serious consideration in how it is wielded. A boy has been charged with murder. A guilty verdict will mean the death penalty. The evidence against him is convincing, but nothing can be taken for granted when life and death are on the line.
It's not easy to raise my hand and send a boy off to die without talking about it first.
Justice is not an abstraction. It is something achieved through rigorous analysis, weighing of the evidence, and adherence to the principle of innocent until proven guilty. The resulting film is both aspirational and cautionary, at once a testament to the high ideals of the law and an urging for the work necessary to realize those ideals. 12 Angry Men's origins are found in television. A prolific TV format in the 50s was the live teleplay, which is basically exactly what it sounds like, a stage play broadcast live over television. Cast and crew would rehearse the material and execute it live, with directors cutting between multiple cameras in real time. This was also the background Sidney Lumet came from, having already directed over a dozen TV plays and dozens more TV episodes by 1957. According to Lumet, this experience was an invaluable cinematic education in the technical requirements of filmmaking, and that expertise is evident in his debut feature. 12 Angry Men is a stage-bound adaptation that does not hide from those origins, locking all its action in a single room as characters talk for 90 minutes. Yet its sense of visual storytelling is astonishingly assured, confident, and effective. When you have to cut between 3 cameras in real time live, you develop some strong instincts for how to tell a story with pictures. Lumet would in fact mark the beginning of a mass television exodus, with a slew of directors trained in live broadcast making their way to Hollywood. Fellow TV peer John Frankenheimer would also make his big screen debut in 1957, while Arthur Penn would follow suit a year later. These movies did not shake the world like 12 Angry Men did, but by the 60s, Frankenheimer and Penn would direct some of the most important Hollywood films of the decade in The Manchurian Candidate and Bonnie and Clyde, masterpieces which also helped shape the new Hollywood which would emerge in the 70s. Indeed, it was in that new Hollywood that Lumet would find his greatest cinematic success post 12 Angry Men. And speaking of 12 Angry Men, it's worth noting that the original TV version's director would also find great success in late 60s and early 70s Hollywood. 12 Angry Men did not originate small-scale drama in the American cinema, nor was it the first big-screen adaptation of live TV. The 1955 adaptation of Marty wasn't just a bigger hit than 12 Angry Men, it was also more lauded, winning the Best Picture Oscar and the Palme d'Or at the Cannes Film Festival. Its success is in fact credited with helping get 12 Angry Men made in the first place. But time has rendered a different verdict, 12 Angry Men enduring as a classic and one of the most beloved movies ever made, while Marty has receded in the public conscious. There's a lot of explanations to account for this, but I think a big one is 12 Angry Men's lack of gimmickry. Marty is a good movie, but a fundamental part of its appeal is the novelty of seeing a love story about two average, working-class schmoes rather than glamorous Hollywood beauties. 12 Angry Men also rejects Hollywood glamour in its sparse location and supporting cast populated by character actors largely plucked from television, but these aren't elements the film leans on or overly emphasizes. They are simply part of the film's texture, things you don't even think about as you get sucked into the story. It's not a film which offers novelty, it's a film which marks a shift in style, towards the more naturalistic, grounded, and stripped down, yet still cinematically ambitious. Between Lumet and Kubrick, the future of cinema in 1957 looked very bright indeed. But in the present, the best cinema was not found on American screens. You might have noticed that while this video has thus far primarily focused on American cinema, I've also frequently alluded to the international triumphs of 1957. This is unavoidable. While Hollywood made plenty of great movies in 1957, the year's best primarily came from elsewhere. 1957 is in fact a rich cross-section of many countries experiencing a cinematic renaissance or at the cusp of entering one. Some of this has already been hinted at here. The Cranes Are Flying is credited with launching a Soviet new wave, paving the way for a new generation of filmmakers in the 60s, and ushering a new era for director Mikhail Kalatozov. Fellow war film Cannell marked the second in a thematic trilogy of anti-war pictures from Polish director Andrzej Wajda, while Indian films Mother India and Piazza marked two distinct yet revered landmarks in Hindi cinema and progenitors of Bollywood. Then there's Japan, which in 1957 was in the thick of a cinematic golden age. After making films under the limitations of propaganda offices during the war and censorship during American occupation, directors like Kenji Mitsuguchi, Yasujiro Ozu, and Akira Kurosawa emerged in the late 40s and 50s with a combination of newly found freedom and finely honed artistic sensibilities. The films these three made across the decade are vastly different in style and substance. You wouldn't confuse Kurosawa's boundless excitement for Ozu's patiently observed intimacy or Mitsuguchi's haunting fables, but all share the excitement of seeing an artist at the height of their craft. This golden age did suffer a great loss with Mitsuguchi's untimely death in 1956, but Japan's cinema continued to triumph in the following year. Kurosawa would release two features in 1957, Throne of Blood and The Lower Depths, each of which adapted the text of a foreign culture and molded it to a specifically Japanese historical context. The latter was based on a play by Russian writer Maxim Gorky in 1902, depicting poverty in turn-of-the-century Russia, now translated to Japan's Edo period in the mid-1800s. And the former is Macbeth, translated from medieval Scotland to Sengoku Japan in the 1500s. The changes in setting are relevant to how Kurosawa reimagines his sources. Sengoku Jita translates to Warring States period, or the age of the country at war, according to Japanese film scholar Stephen Prince, and it is this historical backdrop which informs Kurosawa's Macbeth. In this context, Macbeth analog Lord Washizu's regicide is just another chapter in a long cycle of treacherous violence. Indeed, the evidence of warfare is everywhere, in the discarded piles of bones which surround the witch's lair, in the blood from a previous murder which still stains the walls in a room on Washizu's estate, and of course, in the exhaustion of Washizu's men, who when the prophecy of the forest rising to attack is fulfilled, themselves turn treacherous to their lord, perpetuating the cycle of violence further in one of the most astonishing action set pieces ever filmed. I also love how the bones by the witch or the bloodstained walls refer back metatextually to Shakespeare's original play. This is most obvious in the blood, Lady Macbeth's blood-stained hands that refuse to wash, expanding outward into the setting, reflecting the expansion of violence. But more generally, the indicators of prior acts of violence and the betrayal of Lord Washizu's men place Throne of Blood within the greater lineage of Macbeth adaptations. All of this has happened before, all of this will happen again. While Throne of Blood's setting is well suited to its source, the Lower Depths setting is seemingly atypical. Scholars Kiko MacDonald and Thomas Reimer note that the mid-19th century Edo period is generally thought of as a very prosperous time, yet Kurosawa still locates the era's poverty and desperation with Gorky's collection of impoverished tenement dwellers. There's an understated historical revisionism in the film's challenges to the typical perception of the Edo period, and possibly a contemporary critique as well. It strikes me as more than sheer coincidence that the Lower Depths emerged at the cusp of Japan's economic miracle, a period best known for the rapid growth and expansion of the Japanese economy, and like the Edo period, now perceived as an era of prosperity. I can't help but wonder if Kurosawa is suggesting that such prosperity was not shared by all, and that the poorest Japanese residents were still being neglected. It would not be out of character for Kurosawa, who made similar coded critiques of contemporary Japan through the veil of historical settings in Rashomon and Seven Samurai, and who would make far more overt criticisms of Japan's corporate culture in the 60s with The Bad Sleep Well and High and Low. It's unclear if The Lower Depths is deliberately engaging in similar critique as well, but it's an interesting subtext to work through. Whatever the case, though, exploitation of Japan's poor would not be limited to the Lower Depths. Masaki Kobayashi's Black River would move into post-war Japan, set near a US Army base following a pair of downtrodden youths. The specificity of that backdrop would seemingly indict American occupation as the cause for the conflicts and social problems the film depicts, something further emphasized in the opening sequence, which specifically highlights the American soldiers as outsiders intruding on and policing Japan. But Kobayashi does not leave things so simply. Ever the critic of Japan's social systems and an advocate for the exploited, Kobayashi finds the film's true villains in the vicious criminal and greedy slumlord who prey upon the impoverished tenants. That exploitation might be empowered by the American occupation, but it is not the single source of it. The film was an important step for Kobayashi, who had already made politically charged and complex films throughout the decade, but the shades of noir in Black River's visual style and seedy crime story injected a degree of cinematic verve his earliest films lacked. And Black River was not the year's only Japanese movie with detectable traces of noir. The genre's high-contrast lighting, dingy, smoke-filled rooms, and air of secrecy are also found, shockingly, in Yasujiro Ozu's Tokyo Twilight. Ozu's films are deceptively simple, quiet observations of societal norms and familial conflict which eventually erupt into profound currents of emotion, even as Ozu's own voice never rises above a gentle whisper. Tokyo Twilight is largely of this mold, yet its narrative ingredients are much more overtly dramatic, with unwanted pregnancy, loveless young romance, and most significantly, a mother who abandoned her daughters in childhood re-emerging in their adult lives. Ozu both adapts his style to this heightened narrative while remaining true to his sensibilities. The heavy shadows and hanging lamps, along with stretches of the film generally being set in the seedier parts of Tokyo, lend the film a heightened sense of danger, befitting a plot cloaked in family secrets, yet the film also sidesteps a lot of the more obvious dramatic high points, undercutting the big twists and turns for something more ruminative. Despite the potential salaciousness of the story, Ozu locates the drama less in the details themselves and more on societal pressures that women marry and have children, something his characters thrash against, yet also grapple with in complex and even contradictory ways. On that note, kudos to Ishizu Yamada, who plays the mother with a lot of sympathy, grace, and pain rather than outward villainy. And we know she can play great villains based on her work as the Lady Macbeth analog in Throne of Blood and the Slumlord in Black River. Yamada is virtually unrecognizable across these three films, but she's the year's secret MVP. While the Japanese cinema was at peak powers in 1957, Italian cinema was at a point of transformation. In the post-war years, neorealism emerged as a style which chronicled the devastation of war and subsequent social decay with a degree of authenticity, shooting on dilapidated Italian streets, employing non-actors or non-movie stars, and telling grim stories of living in poverty or the displacement of the war. But by the 50s, Italy's cinema started to pull in different directions, and this shift is evident across three 1957 films: Federico Fellini's Nights of Cabiria, Luchino Visconti's La Notte Bianca, and Michelangelo Antonioni's El Grido. Each of these directors had their roots in neorealism. Fellini was co-writer of two of the genre's pivotal texts. Yet these three films contain some elements of neorealism without really being a part of it. Nights of Cabiria maintains the genre's focus on poverty and use of real locations, telling the story of a sex worker named Cabiria as she navigates love and heartbreak in Rome, with much of the film shot where real sex workers did in fact live and work. The film also draws attention to Cabiria's poverty, both overtly, as in the opening scene where Cabiria is robbed by a John, and more subtly, as in the small house on the outskirts of town that she shares with a roommate. And yet, there's this pervasive feeling of whimsy and fantasy which permeates through the picture. Part of this is Fellini's free-flowing camera, part of this is Nino Rota's enchanting score, but the real culprit is the titular character. Cabiria is just such a warm presence, optimistic and joyous even in the face of hardship, and brought to life with an infectious likability by Giulietta Massini, that the film enters a realm of wonderment. The result is a film which is far less despairing than your Bicycle Thieves or Umberto D's, and ultimately less concerned strictly with Italy's poverty, rendered here more as textures of Cabiria's life than as a primary focus. La Notte Bianca steps even further away from the principles of neorealism. While Fellini at least shot in real locations, Visconti shot in the studio, his team building an elaborate set to simulate Livorno's streets and waterways. And you can tell, not that the movie looks fake, quite the contrary, the sets are extremely impressive and convincing, but there's also an isolated, too perfectly composed beauty to them that gives away that it isn't real. And this is clearly by design, the film's plot concerning an incurable romantic pining for a woman who is herself in love with a man who left town and may never return. Visconti leans into the aching melodrama of the material with imagery which crosses beauty with hints of melancholy. That late film Snowfall in particular is just exquisite. The film was adapted from a short story by Fyodor Dostoevsky, making 1957 an incredible year for adaptations of Russian literature by non-Russians, and carries the atmosphere of a romantic fable. One could extract a political message from that material, but the central tragedy is presented in personal terms rather than sociological ones. Finally, we come to Il Grido, which on paper seems the most aligned with neorealism. The hero is a working-class factory worker, the film was shot on location without the high production value and control of studio filmmaking, and the plot is meandering, more concerned with observation than telling a point A to B story. But Antonioni seems entirely uninterested in probing social problems. Instead, his film kicks off when protagonist Aldo's marriage proposal is turned down, prompting him to leave home and wander through Po Valley, shacking up with various women in a quest for something. Maybe it's new love, maybe it's revenge on the woman who spurned him, maybe he's just hurt and passively moving through life. It's not entirely clear, and the film is ultimately more about how Aldo's physical journey reflects a metaphysical one, the neo-realist trappings serving as background for an introspective character piece. In this respect, El Grido looks forward to Antonioni's more elegant and austere 60s films, these mysterious inquiries into a similar sense of ennui. Nights of Cabiria likewise foreshadows the growing sense of fantasy and wonderment in Fellini's work, expanding outward from a singular character and encompassing the entire scope of his films. This is not to say these figures were entirely abandoning neorealism. Visconti would in fact follow La Notte Bianca with a headfirst dive back into neorealist aesthetics with Rocco and his brothers. 1957 did not mark the end of neorealism so much as it signified filmmakers grappling with it as a style rather than an end unto itself. The year saw other major national cinematic milestones. François Truffaut's short film Les Mistons preceded the French New Wave, which would soon take over cinemas, while fellow French filmmaker Chris Marker continued his early experimentation with documentary form with his film Letter from Siberia. Then there's all the movies I wasn't able to track down a copy of, like Rio Zona Norte from Brazil or The Blue Sky Maiden from Japan. It was a truly glorious year for the international art cinema, and fittingly, the year also saw the release of the poster child for international art cinema, the single film which has endured as the symbol for what an arty foreign movie looks like.
Vem är du?
Jag döden.
It's hard to overstate the significance of the Seventh Seal. In an era where images of imagined apocalypses reigned supreme in cinemas, the Seventh Seal offered a glimpse of an apocalyptic past, of a medieval Sweden ravaged by plague and years of bloodshed, while its people do their best to survive in the face of a very literal death. The imagery of a knight playing chess with the personification of death proved instantly iconic, subject to countless imitation and parody from a diverse range of artists. The film did not wholly invent the image, which finds its roots in the medieval paintings of Albertus Pictor, nor did the film originate a cinematic portrayal of a man contending with a physical embodiment of death, the Seventh Seal in fact taking direct influence from The Phantom Carriage, a classic of Swedish cinema in the silent era. Despite these precursors, though, the Seventh Seal still tapped into something essential and defining in its cinematic representation of death and in the thematic questions that representation asked. The film's reputation is heavy and grim, a serious work of art probing the depths of human experience in a possibly godless universe. That's true to a point, but it should be stressed that such depth is not cloaked in mystery or opaque metaphor. The Seventh Seal is incredibly direct in addressing its existential conflicts and fears. As protagonist Antonius Bloch admits in Confession, I want knowledge. Not faith, not assumptions, but knowledge. I want God to stretch out his hand, uncover his face, and speak to me. It is the purest expression of a crisis of faith, where faith is no longer enough to sustain belief. This is stirred in part by Antonius' history as a knight fighting in the Crusades, unseen in the film, yet felt through their haunting omission, but the greater catalyst is, of course, the meeting with death. At its most fundamental level, the Seventh Seal tells the story of a man gripped in fear, desperate to know what will happen when he dies. Despite being wrapped in Judeo-Christian imagery and ritual, I truly cannot think of a more universally relatable anxiety. Not merely the fear of death, but the uncertainty of what, if anything, lies beyond. That might account for why a film with the reputation as the embodiment of a challenging art film has also so fully permeated art and culture moving forward. It might also be because, amidst the grim ambiguities of a life beyond death, the film also highlights moments of levity and grace. Moments not just worth living for, but that provide meaning to a life. There's a sensitivity to the film that allows for a degree of comfort, even as it denies any real answers. It must also be said that the Seventh Seal is, in fact, pretty funny. The cynical Squire Jans especially gets some very witty dialogue, and there's also all sorts of buffoonery involving a cheating wife and a handsome actor, which crosses into bawdy sex comedy. And I wouldn't, strictly speaking, call this comedic relief. It's all thematically essential. While Antonius faces his spiritual doubts with anxiety and torment, Jans protects himself from the world's horrors, which we do see absolutely affect him, with irreverence and mirth. More broadly, comedy expands the range of experiences the seventh seal can encompass. Yes, the human condition is marked by suffering and terror, but also comedy, and therefore any attempt to ruminate on life and death must also address the funny parts. And the seventh seal has funny parts. This is a movie where one of Death's victims climbs up a tree, so Death has to brandish a saw and get to work. Take it from someone who has seen this movie in a theater, this scene absolutely kills with a packed house. The Seventh Seal proved seminal upon release, and confirmed Ingmar Bergman one of the cinema's greatest living artists. Bergman had been directing for over a decade at that point, and had been building a substantial reputation in the early 50s with Summer with Monica and Smiles of a Summer Night. But The Seventh Seal was a different level entirely. And the crazy thing is, this wasn't even Bergman's only movie in 1957. 10 months after Seal hit theaters, Bergman would drop Wild Strawberries, another film dealing with mortality, this time in the story of an elderly professor reflecting on his life's experiences as he drives to his alma mater to collect an award. If The Seventh Seal announced Bergman as a leader in world cinema, Wild Strawberries christened him Sweden's greatest cinematic export since the silent era. I say this not just because Wild Strawberries is a brilliantly constructed film with some show-stopping dream sequences and a rich central character in the elderly Professor Isaac Borg, but because a passing of the guard is woven into the film's core. Isaac is played by Victor Härström, the same man who directed and starred in The Phantom Carriage, along with a trove of other classic Swedish films in the 1910s and 20s. Wild Strawberries was the man's last performance on film, and as such, acts as a deeply moving swan song for an institution of Swedish cinema. Playing a highly accomplished academic, the film presents Härström as the decorated and deeply respected public figure the man truly was, and allows him to receive some flowers, even if it's in a fictional context. More broadly, the film is also just a great showcase for Härström's talents as an actor, effortlessly conveying someone of great professional success, yet who has also endured great personal suffering. A man in his twilight years, looking to reconcile his past now that he's so much closer to the end than the beginning. Indeed, Härström would pass away just 3 years later at 80 years old. Bergman described Wild Strawberries as Victor's film rather than his own, and while I get where he's coming from, the film is as much a testament to Bergman's artistry as it is to Härström's. The aforementioned dream sequences are indeed showstoppers, immaculately constructed bits of interiority, dense in symbolism, yet also pleasurable strictly in their aesthetics. At the core of these dreams and memories is a fear of death, which tethers the film to Bergman's other triumph from 1957, but the context and implications are different. Unlike Antonius, Isaac is not contending with the Grim Reaper with such immediacy, his own death still in a vague future rather than directly in front of him. Consequently, his anxieties are more about reflecting on the life he's led, decisions he's made, and the paths untaken. As Isaac's family, whether real or projections of his subconscious, lay out who he is and what they think of him, Bergman's screenplay is unsparing. There's a piercing quality to their assessments that is sometimes painful, but also strangely cathartic. While the dialogue is hurtful, it also lacks meanness or cruelty, allowing Isaac to come to a measure of peace and acceptance with who he is and who he has been. This is perhaps the strongest tie to the Seventh Seal, and betrays a profound optimism at the heart of both works. For all the ways each film probes insecurity and despair, each also concludes with images of goodness. I've mentioned other directors who released multiple films in 1957, but none of them come close to Bergman, whose double feature is made up of two of the best films he ever made, and I do not say that lightly. It is befitting a year where world cinema reigned with such strength and vitality. But before I end this video, I want to return one last time to the United States and talk about two more films.
I love this dirty town.
Elia Kazan's A Face in the Crowd and Alexander McKendrick's Sweet Smell of Success are the hardest films to place in the context of Hollywood cinema in 1957. Neither filmmaker could really be described as young. Both men were in their mid-40s and had been making movies since the 1940s, yet it would also be inaccurate to say they were a piece with the old studio guard. McKendrick was a Scotsman who had made his name in British comedy, making his first American film with Sweet Smell of Success, while Kazan's background in theater and use of method acting distinguished his style from the traditions of classical Hollywood. Moreover, Kazan's political activities had made him a unique pariah. Through his films, Kazan had established himself as a socially conscious liberal, objecting to the evils of racism, anti-Semitism, and the failures of the criminal justice system. But in 1952, at the height of the Red Scare, when Senator Joseph McCarthy was on a witch hunt for anyone with communist affiliations, and Hollywood capitulated by blacklisting those identified from working, Kazan named names to the House Un-American Activities Committee. 2 days after his testimony, Kazan took out an ad in the New York Times defending his actions and urging others to do the same. 2 years after that, Kazan directed a film where the protagonist's naming of names is framed as a supreme act of heroism and bravery.
You ratted on us, Terry! From where you stand, maybe, but I'm standing over here now. I was ratting on myself all them years, I didn't even know it.
Putting aside issues of how Kazan was pressured by HUAC to comply or my own ethical qualms with his testimony, the act proved isolating. Kazan spurned by many of his friends and peers. His career was far from over, mind you. On the Waterfront would even win him his second Best Director Oscar. Yet the HUAC testimony would continue to haunt him, and still stains his legacy to this day. Thus, we have two directors in a strange sort of limbo. Not really young, yet not really old. A foreigner on American soil, and a liberal resented for his compliance to right-wing agendas. It's not surprising that the films this pair made weren't just anomalous within the Hollywood that produced them, they were also bitter and angry. Indictments of the corruption at the intersections of politics and media, driven by the vanity and ambition of men with the power to turn their worlds into their own private playthings. I would not call them the best films of 1957, but in 2024, I would call them the most prescient. First up was A Face in the Crowd. The film centers on Lonesome Rhodes, a drunken drifter and musician plucked out of obscurity by radio journalist Marcia Jeffries for broadcast. Rhodes unexpectedly becomes a media sensation, soon propelled to television and superstardom, becoming a cult of personality with significant influence over his audience. As advertising opportunities give way to political influence, Rhodes hired to help shape the image of a senator with eyes on the presidency, the star's own ego and ambitions grow increasingly unrestrained and insatiable, Rhodes using and berating all in his orbit while enriching himself. The film received a lot of attention in the wake of Donald Trump's 2016 election, and it's not hard to see why. Trump might as well be a direct successor to Lonesome Rhodes, a loudmouth buffoon whose ignorance and lack of decorum are twisted into virtues, that he's anti-establishment and tells it like it is. A man who poses as a working-class everyman while enjoying tremendous wealth and acceptance within elite circles. A man whose vulgarity and clownish behavior are made advantages in the medium of television, where the ability to demand attention is the single greatest attribute. Watching A Face in the Crowd conjures exactly how it felt to live through 2016. And specifically the terror as a carnival sideshow gradually became the most important person in America. But it isn't just the swindler that the film targets. Kazan also takes aim at the swindler's enablers, the handlers who discovered Rhodes and first gave him a platform, the politicians hoping to siphon his appeal to bolster their own power, the networks and advertisers who profit from his antics, all deluded enough to think they can control Rhodes to get what they want, while in fact the opposite occurs, and Rhodes squeezes what he wants from them, all the while growing more monstrous and grotesque. The cynicism does not end at how easily a demagogue can seize tremendous influence over a country's populace, but that said demagogue would bring with him a trove of hangers-on benefiting from his influence. Ultimately though, the film extends these handlers some grace. As Marcia's disgust with Rhodes reaches its breaking point, she leaks audio of Rhodes berating his audience during a live broadcast. Instantly, Rhodes' base turns against him, the man in his career in ruin. Rhodes is last seen in a penthouse, wasting away for an imaginary audience, as Walter Matthau gives a monologue about how Americans have a short-term memory, and Rhodes will have a modest resurgence. He'll be back on TV again, but he'll never wield the same powers he did at his peak. As a conclusion to the story, it's poignant and dramatic and deeply naive. In real life, a leaked tape of Trump saying far more damning things than Rhodes ever said did not stop him from being elected president. And even after his demonstrable incompetence, his lack of efforts to actually help poor rural whites who voted for him, his clear disdain for many of his own supporters, even after evidence and indictments for his many, many crimes, he still won the presidency again. His enablers don't get to take solace that they at least stopped the monster before it got too big. The monster lives, and we're all stuck in his world.
You were taken in just like we were all taken in. But we get wise to him. That's our strength. But we get wise to him. But we get wise to him.
Perhaps that's why, for all A Face in the Crowd's insights and its cinematic virtues in its writing and performances, I find myself more drawn to Sweet Smell of Success. The film is another dark portrait of media figures who build a cult of personality and wield that power to selfish, harmful ends. Burt Lancaster plays J.J. Hunsaker, an unscrupulous gossip columnist using his influence to prevent his sister Susan from marrying a jazz guitarist he does not approve of. The plot technically has lower stakes than A Face in the Crowd's, but it feels more dangerous. Much, much more. Hunsaker's eyes peer over Manhattan streets, accentuating the atmospheric noir visuals and jazzy score. The action set on darkened streets or in crowded bars and clubs, where cutthroat power machinations occur. And of course, there's the dialogue.
Conjugate me a verb, for instance, to promise. You promise to break up that romance. When?
You want something done, JJ, but I doubt if you yourself know what's involved.
I'm a schoolboy. Teach me, teach me.
The film's screenplay, co-written by one of the writers Kazan named to HUAC, is famous for its sharp writing. But sharp doesn't really do it justice. The dialogue is clever and witty and gets in your head, yes, but it's also weird.
Cat's in a bag and the bag's in a river.
Don't be a two-time loser, Sidney. The penalty could be severe. I like Harry, but I can't deny he sweats a little.
That's the charming street urchin face. Dallas, your mouth is as big as a basket and twice as empty.
My right hand hasn't seen my left hand in 30 years.
I'll do it.
The lines aren't smooth or effortlessly exchanged with rapid-fire patter. They're coarse and dripping in malice.
You're dead, son. Get yourself buried.
The writing betrays the ruthlessness at the heart of the film and its characters. As McKendrick himself said, these are people who enjoy grotesquely colorful forms of speech. Rhodes and Hunsaker are both egomaniacs seeking to shape the world in their image, but JJ is more calculating and assured. And unlike Rhodes, Hunsaker doesn't face any real comeuppance. He keeps his media empire and his position atop it. His lackey Sidney finally takes a modest stand against Hunsaker, and Hunsaker has him brutally beaten in the streets. The only thing JJ loses is his sister. Though he begs her to stay, Susan breaks away from her brother in the film's climactic moments, leaving to start life anew, free from JJ's conniving influence. Both films end with their demagogue abandoned. The difference is Rhodes has been abandoned by the world, while Hunsaker has only been abandoned by one person. Maybe two if you count Sidney. I find this a more honest ending, or at least a more helpful one right now, when so many of the worst people in the world are being rewarded with more power. And there's not much most of us can really do about it. But one thing we can do is sever their influence directly over us. refuse to fall in line with the despair and powerlessness they want us to feel. And at the very least, we can deny them rent-free space in our minds. Let Susan be a model to us all. The tyrants and bullies who abuse their power and cause harm may never face real comeuppance, but that doesn't mean they deserve our attention. So, if 1957 was so great for movies, how come it doesn't get more recognition? Well, I think the dominance of world cinema is definitely a factor. Discussions of best movie years tend to be very America-centric. 1939 is specifically highlighted for its embodiment as a triumph of the Hollywood studio system. International triumphs like France's The Rules of the Game or Japan's The Story of the Last Chrysanthemum, basically incidental. You'll hear a lot in Brian Raftery's book about the many films which graced American multiplexes in 1999. You'll hear less about Spain's All About My Mother, France's Beau Travail, or Canada's Existenz. 1957 certainly offered its share of American triumphs, lots in fact, but the greatest volume of quality was felt elsewhere, and any account of the year's cinema would have to center that fact. Which, frankly, from the perspective of book sales, is a lot less marketable. Quick additional note from editing, that two of the best Hollywood films of the year were also extremely British is likely also a factor. That said, Farber and McClellan's Cinema 62 places great emphasis on world cinema when arguing for the vitality of its year, so an American bias doesn't totally account for 1957's lack of acknowledgement. If I had to put my finger on one reason, I would say it's because 1957 wasn't really the pinnacle for any filmmaker or film movement. If you look at the other years highlighted, you'll notice they tend to either mark a massive sea change or represented a summit of some sort for cinematic artistry. But 1957 isn't exactly either of those things. It is a period of transition between two eras that demonstrates the strengths of both, but it was not itself a turning point. It was a year which saw the brilliant artistry of world cinema, but that was true throughout the 50s and would continue to be true in the 60s. The golden age of Japanese cinema, the transition from Italian neorealism, these had both been developing already. Even Igmar's breakthrough success, so seismic, was still building on prior triumphs. Additionally, among the many classic films from widely beloved auteurs the year saw, how many would you argue were that director's best movie? Is anyone going to say The Wings of Eagles is John Ford's best film, the year after The Searchers? Or Witness for the Prosecution Billy Wilder's, when he'd follow it up with Some Like It Hot and The Apartment back to back? Is Throne of Blood Kurosawa's best? Hell, it's not even his best Shakespeare adaptation. The Cranes Are Flying is my favorite Kalatazov film, but its technical achievement was probably surpassed by I Am Cuba. The Bridge on the River Kwai is, by all metrics, the most successful movie of 1957. The highest grossing, the most Oscar winning, taking home Best Picture and Director, and a lot more, still widely beloved today. But that's also all true of Lean's follow-up, Lawrence of Arabia, which is also probably a better movie. The Seventh Seal is Bergman's most iconic, but given the man had another 50 years of cinema ahead of him, including future masterpieces which pushed in all sorts of different directions, it's hard to single that out as his peak. Point being, 1957 is more a cross-section of brilliance than it is a summit or moment of transformation. But that's also why I think it's the best. Though it lacks the same appealing narratives of the more lionized years, the breadth of films, made across styles, generations, and cultures, demonstrates a healthy variety in cinematic offerings. 1957 is the best film year, not because it encompasses the best in film, nor because it saw the most bangers released in theaters across 12 months, or even because it was the most important for historic influence, but because it demonstrates how many different things film can be, how many different things film can make you think and feel, and the many different ways filmmakers can inspire those thoughts and feelings.